In the summer of 1964 in Houston, Texas, Andrea Yates was born. And in the summer of 2001 in Houston, Texas, Andrea Yates drowned her 5 children in a bathtub in their home.
It's a horror.
Tragedy is an understatement.
One of the most horrific crimes imaginable.
Postpartum depression and psychosis.
A watershed for mental illness in the criminal justice system.
A lot of media attention, but this is definitely not a new problem.
But what happened in the 37 years between those two events tells an incredibly important story. It's a story of happiness, of sadness, and of severe mental health struggles.
Had not taken their lives, what did you think would happen to them? And where would they end up?
It's a story of warning signs to learn from. It's a story of spiritual sabotage, system failures, and shocking manipulation.
We all go to hell, yes!
It's a story of murder, but murder is not the whole story. This is the story of Andrea Yates. Postpartum psychosis is a severe psychiatric emergency that involves an acute psychotic episode beginning in the weeks just before or after giving birth. It can be extremely dangerous and even deadly for the people who experience it and their families. This video is meant to educate on the topic of postpartum psychosis and share some of the warning signs to hopefully help prevent stories like Andrea Yates in the future. Andrea Yates was born Andrea Kennedy on July 2nd, 1964 in Houston, Texas. She was the youngest of 5 siblings and grew up in a relatively middle-class family. Friends of the family would describe the Kennedys as high-achieving and goal-oriented, and Andrea was no exception. In high school, she was captain of the swim team and served as historian for the National Honor Society. And although she would not be described as the most outgoing or confident person, she had a good group of core friends, the same friends who 20 years later would have trouble reconciling the Andrea they knew with the events that took place in the summer of 2001. Friends of Andrea's would describe her as someone who had really lofty goals and left little room for error. She seemed to be really hard on herself and had what we might refer to as a type A personality. She had a knack for perfectionism and maybe didn't always engage in the most kind self-talk. After high school, Andrea went on to work at a grocery store while also going to school at the University of Texas Health Sciences Center, where she earned her degree in nursing, and subsequently she was hired at the world-renowned MD Anderson in Houston, Texas as a registered nurse. After college, Andrea was working as a new nurse and living alone at an apartment complex in Houston, Texas. Also living at that apartment complex was Rusty Yates. Rusty grew up in Tennessee with his mom, dad, and brother, and he also excelled in high school. He was a Cub Scout, he played football, and he was a member of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. After high school, he decided to continue on with his education at Auburn University, and during his time there, he did an internship with NASA. Following his graduation from Auburn, he got hired on as a full-time engineer at NASA in Houston, Texas. It was the summer of 1989 when they met, and just a few years later, on April 17th, 1993, they would tie the knot. Just a few months after that, in June, she would find out that she was pregnant with their first child. On the surface, this all sounds like a very normal, happy love story, but underneath that happy facade, there were 2 undercurrents of the Yates marriage that, when mixed together, would serve to create a significant degree of toxicity. The first of these was Andrea's very deep-seated need to never disappoint anyone or let anyone down, and that included always having a happy facade and really having trouble asking for help. Rusty would eventually recount a story in their early marriage where he had offered to get Andrea something to drink, and she had responded with, "Oh, no, you don't have to do that." He would later cite her ongoing need to never be a burden on anyone as something that made it really difficult to support Andrea when she was struggling or when there were things going on within their marriage. The second undercurrent that will have a massive impact on the events at play in this story is Rusty Yates' subscription to a particularly fringe and extremist view of Christianity. Midway through college, Rusty had lost his dad suddenly to a heart attack and abandoned his ROTC scholarship, and he was in search of a new religious identity. He ended up finding this spiritual identity in a charismatic street preacher named Michael Warnecki. Michael Warnecki, along with his wife and their 6 children, would take to the streets to preach their particular brand of religion to anyone who would listen, and they were often in trouble with local law enforcement for using particularly aggressive tactics to get their message across.
God is going to destroy this earth and all you wretched sinners.
There were a few key points of this religion, which Andrea would also end up adopting after getting into a relationship with Rusty, that will play big parts in this story. Wives must submit to their husbands in all things, and people who are married must have as many children as the Lord will bless them with, meaning they are not to use any form of contraception. As an aside to that, Warnecki also believed that pain during childbirth was a necessary rite of passage, and you were not supposed to use any kind of pain meds. So whether because she wanted to or because she was essentially coerced to by her religious leaders, she did birth all 5 of her children without any pain meds whatsoever. The third belief, and this one is really key to this story, was that parents were responsible for making sure that their children were not corrupted by outside worldly influences. And parents is probably not the right way to put that. It was very heavily placed on the mother to be the primary caretaker of the children, and that caretaking role was all encompassed by ensuring that there was no corruption from the world on the children. And it went a step even further than that to blame the mother if the children became corrupted by the world, and that would mean that both the mother and the children would be banished to hell. That last point is one that will become an obsessive rumination for Andrea as she begins moving through these episodes of postpartum psychosis and other mental health struggles. Rusty and Michael Warnecki struck up a friendship, and Rusty quickly became a very devout follower of their particular church. The Warneckis would mainly communicate with their followers through written communication and occasionally sending some videos and things like that, but primarily was letters and these leaflets that they would send out. Later on, during Andrea Yates' trial, the Los Angeles Times would actually refer to these leaflets, which did end up becoming a big part of the testimony in the trials, as doomsday pamphlets full of hysterical religious zeal. After Rusty and Andrea had been dating for a while, she would also join this religion, and Warnecki's wife, Leslie, who I will refer to as Rachel moving forward because she changed her name from Leslie to Rachel to be more biblical, they would strike up a friendship, and Andrea and Rachel would communicate fairly frequently by writing letters back and forth to one another. These letters also become a significant player in the trial later on. Even before they got married, Andrea and Rusty would be open with their friends and family about the fact that they intended to have as many children as God would bless them with.
She wouldn't like me to say this, but she called herself Fertile Myrtle. That's what she'd say because it seemed like every... Yeah, it wasn't hard.
But it wasn't exactly clear to friends and family whether this was actually something that Andrea wanted or if it was something that she was going along with because the religion told her she must submit to the husband, the religion said that she must have as many children as possible, and we've already discussed she had a pretty deep-seated need not to disappoint people or really push back against things in her life. On February 26, 1994, Andrea and Rusty would welcome their first son, Noah. And on December 15, 1995, they would welcome their second son, John. After each of these deliveries, Andrea would suffer severe bouts of postpartum depression. Rusty would later remark that he found her almost unrecognizable to him in these time frames. And although it wasn't diagnosed at the time, in hindsight, Andrea had reported to one of the psychiatrists that after the birth of Noah, she had experienced a very vivid, very real and scary hallucination of a knife and of stabbing. It is largely thought, particularly given what happens later on, that this was her first episode of postpartum psychosis. Postpartum psychosis is most common after a first birth, and there are a few things that put you at an increased risk of developing this. One of those things is having another mental health disorder, particularly bipolar or schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. The DSM doesn't actually classify postpartum psychosis as a specific and distinct entity in and of itself. So you would be diagnosed with the underlying mental health disorder, then it is associated with the peripartum period. So it might be major depressive disorder with psychotic features that have a peripartum onset. It might be bipolar disorder, currently manic with psychotic features of peripartum onset. But the psychotic features will almost always involve some sort of hallucinations and or delusions. Hallucinations is when you experience some kind of stimuli that is not actually happening in the real world around you. That could be a visual hallucination, an auditory hallucination. Delusions in postpartum psychosis tend to be a little bit less bizarre than we see with other acute psychotic disorders, and they also tend to involve the baby in some way. So they might think that the baby is ill-fated, or the baby's the devil, or they might think that someone's trying to take the baby away or poison the baby, but almost always there is at least some level of delusion involving the baby. Oftentimes in this state of acute psychosis, people will have a particular thought or idea that they ruminate on. And for Andrea, the rumination seemed to always come back to, my children are going to be corrupted and they are going to go to hell, and it's going to be my fault because I was supposed to protect them from being corrupted by outside worldly forces. When you have postpartum psychosis, the recurrence rate in subsequent pregnancies is incredibly high. People who experience their first psychotic episode in the peripartum period have about a 50% chance of having another episode of psychosis sometime in the future, even if they are never postpartum again. Having another baby, having another postpartum period in your life makes that risk even higher. So although she wasn't diagnosed at the time, the risk of this happening again in a future pregnancy was probably over 30%, particularly if it were left untreated or unrecognized again in the future. After Noah was born, Andrea quit her job as a nurse at MD Anderson, and Rusty would say that this is what she really wanted to do. And by all accounts, Andrea really loved being a mother. She was with her kids all the time. She was known for baking them elaborate birthday cakes. She eventually would take over the duties of homeschooling when they got old enough to be in school. She really dove into this role as stay-at-home mom in a very dedicated way. But friends and family would later discuss that they weren't really sure if Andrea was not wanting to go back to her job as a nurse, or if she wanted to, because it was definitely a job she worked hard for and a job that she really loved. And she just wasn't able to because the religion that they were participating in and her husband were really pushing her to be a stay-at-home mom and take on just the childcare duties. In 1996, Rusty would be transferred to a new job in Florida, and they moved the entire family into a 38-foot Jayco camper van trailer.
Going into an RV was kind of more of an experiment for us, and so what we did is we rented our house that we had here and bought a 38-foot travel trailer and pulled it to Florida and lived at a campground in Florida.
They were there for less than a year before he got transferred back to the Houston campus, but in that short time frame, Andrea got pregnant, had a miscarriage, and then ended up getting pregnant again. In early 1997, they moved back to Texas, and Rusty went back to his job at the Houston campus for NASA. They were living in a trailer park, still in that 38-foot camper van, when their next son, Paul, was born in September. So at this point, it is the two adults, a 3.5-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a newborn, all living in a 38-foot trailer. This is where we start to see kind of a stacking escalation of risk factors and undercurrents that are all going to mesh together to create this terrible storm that becomes the story that we're telling today. And we see that what had been a rumination for her in her episodes of postpartum depression, the idea that the children could become corrupted, became such an overarching theme in her life that she could almost not think about anything else. Andrea was incredibly worried about the fact that someone would corrupt her children, and that would mean they would be banished to hell. And she would also, along with them, be banished to hell because she had allowed it to happen.
But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, It is better for him that a heavy millstone be hung around his neck and he be drowned in the depth of the sea. I mean, Jesus, you're saying to kill yourself? Yeah.
Because of these worries, they never had a babysitter. Andrea and the kids really never left the house. The neighbors would later say that they never saw her and the kids outside of the house except maybe to go to the mailbox, and the kids would be with her and then they would go straight home. Inside the home, everything moved along very traditional gender roles. Andrea was responsible for the children, the cooking, the cleaning. Rusty went to work. When he came home, they had dinner. A few nights a week, he would lead the family in a Bible study that they did together. They were not attending normal church at this time because they were following the teachings of the Warneckis, which was largely communicated to them through letters, a few videos here and there. And so not only were they isolated from a social standpoint in day-to-day life, but they didn't have a spiritual community that they were with physically either. They did have a relationship with Andrea's parents, who lived fairly close nearby, and weekly visits with them seems to be pretty much the only social interaction that Andrea or the kids was getting at that time. When they had moved to Florida in 1996, Andrea pretty much gave up all of her belongings except a sewing machine and her cookware and things that she would need for wifely duties. Interestingly, Rusty had some tools and some of his belongings that they shipped to a storage unit in Florida, so he got to keep some of his things. But Andrea really gave up not only herself and her career, but also all of her physical possessions in this time. Later on, a follower of Warnecki who had escaped from this kind of religious fringe group would say that he recognized a lot of the elements of this seemingly austere lifestyle as being from the teachings of Michael Warnecki.
To hold a job and to even live in a home is to participate in the evil satanic conspiracy against God. So, for Rusty to get his family in this mobile home and to kind of emulate this nomadic lifestyle comes directly from the teachings of Michael Warnecki.
I want to include a clip here of a leaflet that went out to Andrea, and I want you to hear it being read with the words on the screen.
Modern Mother Worldly was very, very lazy. All her children drove her crazy. The Bible told her to spank and train them, but society said she must never constrain them. The fruit of rebellion she did now see. On the day of judgment she will have no plea. Modern Mother Worldly, cast in hell. Now what becomes of the children of such a Jezebel?
Most of us would think this is wild. I am not going to listen to anyone who is telling me such extreme things. But if you put yourself into Andrea's shoes at this time, where she's got 3 very young kids, she's very much bought in, along with her primary and almost sole support person, her husband, Rusty, to this fringe religion. And now they are telling her that she is a Jezebel, and what will happen to your children if you let them get corrupted, you're failing. And then when we pair these kind of teachings and things that she's reading in these leaflets with what we already know about Andrea's personality from earlier on, that she is very hard on herself, she has a real need for perfectionism, she's not very keen to ask for help most of the time, and she wants to put up a facade that everything is okay, particularly within her life and her marriage and for her children. You can see how this is becoming just a stack of things that eventually are going to be so big they end up contributing to the outcome of this story. I don't think any of you will see me discussing the events of her life as justifying what she did, but I want to add in here that nothing we're talking about is an attempt to justify what happened and what Andrea Yates did to her children. I just think it's very useful from a medical standpoint and from a standpoint of being the public who could have friends, family, or ourselves affected by something like this in the future, to really understand how these things happen, how they're missed, and what that can lead to. I really want to set the stage here before we go into the birth of their 4th child, because this is where what was kind of bubbling under the surface starts to become just a geyser of instability and lack of support. Andrea's gone from working as a nurse in Houston and having a very independent life to now giving up her career, being a stay-at-home mom, taking care of her children in all but complete isolation, and living in a very small living quarter. They eventually moved into a Greyhound bus that was converted into a home, but that is still an extremely small living quarter. By all accounts from friends and family, Andrea was completely overwhelmed at this point. Not only was she caring for all of her children and her husband, but she was also helping to take care of her father, who had become fairly sick with Alzheimer's. Add to that the stakes, which according to her very trusted religious leader, Michael Warnecki, were incredibly high. I want to read you an excerpt from some of the leaflets that he had sent to her. This one is really illuminating to the space that she was operating in at this time. I cannot emphasize this enough. By the time a child is 14 or 15 years old, it is too late. If you feed them with the world's ways, you will reap what you sow. In another one, he wrote, the social interaction the world tells you is so important is exactly what you need to protect your children from. Meanwhile, Andrea is writing to Warnecki's wife, Rachel, and telling her, I'm feeling overwhelmed, which was probably a huge step for Andrea that was not easy for her to do. And rather than responding and telling her to look into getting some help, ask for help from a therapist, go see a doctor, get some help in your community, make some friends, she didn't say anything like that. In fact, in one of the letters from Rachel to Andrea, she actually wrote, Jesus knows how wicked you are, how weak and vulnerable. Even the loneliness works to draw you out to seek and find security in him. Basically saying all of these things that you're feeling are making you closer to Jesus because you are wicked and horrible. And this is not a good thing to say to anyone, obviously, but someone who we now know was in the state of mind that Andrea was, this is a disastrous way to speak to them. She wrote in another letter that the window of opportunity that God has opened up for you at this time through us will only stay open for a certain time. If you allow Satan to come in and steal the understanding, the consequences will be tragic. I just can't get over how incredibly harmful the communication that was occurring between these two people that she really trusted. Obviously, if she is reaching out to Rachel and saying that she is overwhelmed and needs help, something she was known to have a lot of trouble doing, then she really believes that these people have her best interest in mind. And to get that as the communication back, it must really make you think, wow, I am not good enough. This is terrible. I'm ruining everything. And what will the consequences be if I do that? It was my job to raise these children and take care of them. Andrea subsequently found out that she was pregnant again, and in February of 1999, their fourth son, Luke, was born.
Here we are on our way home. What does that say, boys? It says, congratulations, Rusty and Andrea, it's a boy. That's so cute. Giving us a little welcome home. Yeah.
The neighbors would say that they saw Andrea even less than before, which is a pretty big feat to achieve. And she would again reach out to Rachel saying that she was overwhelmed and in need of help. This time, Rachel's letter back to her said, you must accept the reality that this life is under the curse of sin and death. There is nothing in you and your emotions. You are a daughter of Eve. You must become a daughter of the Most High. In June of 1999, when Luke was 4 months old, Andrea would phone Rusty at his job at NASA and tell him that he needed to come home because she needed help. After the birth of Luke, she had become significantly depressed again. And at this point, she still had not ever been officially diagnosed, from what I can tell, and was not under any kind of psychiatric care at all.
The amount of children back to back to back, one after another, my mother and I knew that it took its toll on my sister.
On June 16th, 1999, when she made this phone call, it had been raining for a few days in Houston, and that paired with the fact that she was already having a significant hard time with depression and feeling overwhelmed meant that she got to a breaking point on that day. Rusty did come home from work, and when he opened the door, he found Andrea sitting there trembling, biting the ends of her fingers, not her fingernails, but truly biting her fingers and causing injury to herself. She just looked up at him and said, "I need help."
We looked at that and we said, well, this was a very difficult time. But then we said, well, would we rather have not had Luke? I mean, of course, we'd rather have Luke and have gone through that.
We're at a point where Andrea has now asked for help from the only people she really trusts, Rachel, her religious leader, and now Rusty, her husband. And she's not just saying, "I need help." She's saying it in a way that should be incredibly alarming to anyone who is witnessing it. Unfortunately, the religious leaders don't provide any sort of meaningful help and actually probably made this situation worse, in my opinion. Rusty found himself, I guess, not really knowing what to do. If you're ever in this situation, the right thing to do is immediately take this person to an emergency room or call 911 and have help come to you. He was unsure of what to do and ended up taking Andrea and the boys on a long walk along the seawall because apparently Andrea had always been a big fan of water. Andrea didn't say much on this walk, and the next day, Rusty took her and the boys to stay with her parents for a while. During this stay at her parents' house, Andrea opened a bottle of her dad's prescription medication, trazodone, and took 40 of the 50 milligram tablets out of the bottle and swallowed them all at the same time. Trazodone is a prescription medication most often used as an antidepressant, but can also be prescribed for anxiety and sometimes for help with sleeping. The normal dose is about 50 milligrams per day, so Andrea has effectively taken over a month's worth of this medication in one sitting. Deaths from trazodone overdose are somewhat rare, but this is still extremely dangerous and it can be deadly. It can cause slowed heart rate and slowed breathing to the point of respiratory depression, and also has been known to cause seizures. Later that evening, Luke was crying and Andrea's mom heard him, but Andrea wasn't responding to him, which was very out of character for her because she was always the primary caretaker who was taking care of the babies and was always really responsive to them. And so she tried to shake Andrea awake. She couldn't get her to fully wake up, and Andrea finally said, "I've taken an overdose of medication." Andrea's parents called EMS, and Andrea was taken to Ben Taub Hospital in Houston, where she was treated for an overdose and was given activated charcoal. Activated charcoal is sometimes used in cases of poisoning. It's a very porous substance and it is negatively charged, meaning it can bind to the medications in the gut, and in doing that, hopefully help decrease how much of them are absorbed into the bloodstream, thereby reducing the effects and risk of the overdose that the person has taken. During that hospital stay, she was admitted under the psychiatric unit and she was diagnosed with depression and obviously suicide ideation and attempt. Nurses in the psychiatric unit would describe her as being somewhat unresponsive and a bit listless during the stay, although they did say that at some point during her hospitalization, she had said she wasn't sure why she took an overdose and that maybe she just wanted to sleep. So she wasn't being, I don't think at this point, extremely forthcoming with the true degree of the symptoms that she was experiencing. Another really worrisome aspect of Warnecki's teaching is that they are taught that modern medicine and doctors are evil. I'll put up on screen one of the leaflets that they had sent out that is related to this, so that you can really understand where she might be in considering medication, whether she should be compliant with the medication that the doctors have given her, and whether she should continue to follow up once she gets out of the hospital. There's an account of Rusty speaking about Andrea after having been interviewed by hospital staff, and they ask what might be a weakness in their relationship, and he talks about that, oh, maybe I could treat her with a little bit more respect. He goes on to brag about her having all of the children without pain meds and about how strict they are with the children with using corporal punishment or spankings. And then he is asked what is a strength of Andrea's, and his response at that point was to say, I can't really think of any right now. She was started on Zoloft during this hospitalization, and she stayed inpatient for about a week. The medical records, at least from what I could see, really didn't make it obvious that she was very much better at this point, but she was released under the promise from her family that they would make sure that she was tended to and that she was taking her medications. She did continue to follow up with an outpatient psychiatrist for about a month after she got out of the hospital from this first hospitalization, but she didn't really follow through with making sure that she was taking her medications as prescribed and things like that. She was given the antipsychotic medication Zyprexa at some point after she was released from the hospital, but she wasn't taking any of them regularly. At this point, Rusty said he was trying to prevent another suicide attempt, and he hid all of the medications, guns, and knives that were in the house so that hopefully he could decrease the chances of her trying to kill herself again. This is an important part of taking care of people with suicidal ideation. We recommend that whoever lives with them or is around them frequently takes steps to make sure they're not around things that could be highly lethal if they decided to attempt again. So that includes getting rid of things like guns and knives from the house, locking up medications, and things like that. And just 4 weeks after her release from the hospital, Andrea was in the bathroom when Rusty came home, and he found her sitting there with a knife to her throat, threatening to kill herself.
She had a knife held up to her neck, and it's like she's looking at her neck trying to figure out how to cut herself so that she could successfully kill herself. And I said, give me the knife. And she said, let me do this. And I said, no, give me the knife. And she wouldn't do it. She just stood there like this. So I grabbed her arm and pulled it down, and I pried the knife out of her hand.
Around this time, Andrea reports that she experienced another very vivid hallucination of seeing knives and stabbing and hearing get a knife, get a knife, get a knife, get a knife over and over and over. This is called a command auditory hallucination, and when this is present in postpartum psychosis, it almost always presents with the command being for the person to harm either themselves or the baby. When these command hallucinations are present, because the risk of suicide and infanticide is so high with postpartum psychosis, these people are telling you they need to be in the hospital. This time, Rusty ended up taking Andrea directly to a private psychiatric hospital in Houston. And during the intake, it was reported that she was really fairly silent and still. She didn't really communicate much. She had a small wound on the neck from the knife that she had been holding there and had scratch marks all up and down her legs where she had, in hindsight, told the team that she was trying to prevent herself from getting a knife and hurting one of the kids. Rusty and her did the intake, and they convinced Andrea to sign herself in voluntarily to the psychiatric unit. In the month between being released from the hospital and this second attempt, she had lost a significant amount of weight. She was having extreme sleep disturbances. She was reporting really ruminating over thoughts of the children and how they would turn out. And she had incredibly low energy. Particularly severe and persistent insomnia that is unrelated to taking care of the baby is often one of the first signs that we will see of postpartum psychosis, and it can continue throughout the entire episode as well. This is a recipe for what we were talking about earlier, where you're just stacking up risk factors, because when you have been hospitalized, you're on a new medication, you stop taking it, and then on top of that, you're now having severe sleep disturbances, new hallucinations. This is a kind of revolving door. The lack of sleep worsens the mental health disorder, and so on and so on. She told the hospital staff that when raising her kids, she found it incredibly stressful because she said she was trying to train them up right, and being so young, it felt like a really massive responsibility because she didn't want to fail, meaning she didn't want to let them get corrupted and subsequently banished to hell.
We all go to hell! Yes! To hell!
Jesus does single out one group. Children.
During the stay, she was fairly withdrawn, especially at first, and they described her as being almost in a catatonic state. Catatonia can be experienced with severe mental disorders, and it usually involves repetitive movements that aren't really sensical or purposeful. You also can see people who experience something called catalepsy, which is basically where there's no voluntary movement of the muscles. These patients will sit in a very still state, but if you move their arm, they will keep it there indefinitely until it's moved again, far longer than someone who was just trying to fake this would be able to hold their arm up. It's often seen with things like schizophrenia, but certainly can present as a part of any kind of acute psychotic episode or severe mental disturbance as well. With time and medication during this hospital stay, she would eventually start opening up to staff a little bit. And one of the things that she would communicate to them was that she was incredibly disappointed with herself for the fact that she couldn't, as a nurse, choose a medication that would be more likely to kill her during the first suicide attempt. So you're kind of seeing this layering of her personality peeking out, where she's perfectionistic, there's no room for error. Now she's realized she tried to commit suicide and was not successful, and now she's disappointed in herself for not being successful, and it's just all compounding here. When you pair all of that with the fact that she's not supported in continuing her medication by the religious leaders that she is very invested in, anytime she's discharged from the hospital, it's going to be really unlikely that she will maintain a normal degree of functioning without relapsing back into a severe mental health state. During this hospital stay, it's largely thought that a medication called Haldol was responsible for improving her symptoms enough to where she was functional and able to reflect on the things that I was just telling you she had discussed with the staff there. She was discharged on August 9th, 1999 with a prescription for Haldol as well as a prescription for another antidepressant.
Andrea went from being completely catatonic to sitting on the couch with me in the visiting area, and we carried on just, I referred to it as the best conversation we've ever had. The thing I learned from it is that she needed the right medicine. When I saw her respond to the medicine at that time, I'm like, wow, there's hope. You know, there's hope that Andrea will return.
She was frequently hiding her pills in her cheeks and not taking them even when she was in the hospital. Despite that, she did decide to sign up for some outpatient group and individual therapy when she was discharged from the hospital. During this hospitalization, Rusty had gone out and bought them a house, presumably because he likely rightfully thought that maybe the conditions that they were living in were contributing to her mental health decline. And this would be the home where eventually the events that we are going to discuss would unfold. Andrea didn't go straight from the mental health facility to her home. She ended up going to a group treatment program for 10 days. And during this time, she would actually express regret over her suicide attempt, saying that she forgot that she was needed, that she felt sad and guilty that she was in the hospital away from her children. But she would also indicate to them that she didn't like taking her medications because they made her feel weak. And this is undoubtedly as a result of the things that she had been taught from the religion that she was following. And I do want to add in that these are obviously not mainstream Christian beliefs. Your average person who goes to a Christian church is not going to think most of these things. But when you're following a fringe kind of extremist group, it is something that can sink in. And there are, fundamentalist groups who believe things like this still to this day. In these sessions, while she was at this kind of in-between space before she went home, she had told the group therapy session that she was allowed by Rusty a few hours a week to do what she wanted. And she had been encouraged to increase these hours because it was clear that she had kind of lost her sense of self in all of the caretaking that she was doing. Perhaps most horrifying and shocking is that it's documented in her medical record that at some point during her therapy session, she had indicated to the therapist that her and Rusty really hoped to have more children at some point down the line. They actually wrote into the medical record, apparently patient and husband plan to have as many babies as nature will allow. This will surely guarantee future psychotic depression.
What we were told is that there was a 50% chance that she would be depressed again if we had another child, and if she got depressed again, she would have the same symptoms as she had in 99, and that the same treatment that worked for her in 99 would work again.
So as we mentioned earlier, postpartum psychosis is incredibly rare, and postpartum psychosis that results in death of someone else or suicide is also incredibly rare. But of people who do have postpartum psychosis, about 10% will follow through and eventually be successful in committing suicide, and about 6% will be successful in committing homicide of one or more of their children. So these are really high rates of very severe outcomes. So when you have a person who's been diagnosed with this, you know they have a high recurrence rate, and you know they've already been very nearly successful in killing themselves in order to keep themselves from killing someone they care about. This is really, really worrisome. And again, we're just seeing these things keep stacking on top of each other. So she was inpatient in a psychiatric unit through most of the summer of 1999. And after discharge, she continued, for the most part, taking her medications all through 1999 and 2000. That was until her and Rusty decided it was time to try to get pregnant again.
You know, the decision to have more children in 2001 was based on information we got from the doctor because we'd successfully treated it in 99. If it happened again, we knew how to treat it now. Thinking ahead, we were thinking, well, this will be, if it happens at all, it's going to be a relatively short spell. She'll be down at worst for a while.
Her friends and family report that during this time where she was medicated and continuing to do therapy to some extent, she was actually doing quite well, and that she didn't have any major events going on during that time. But when they decided that they wanted to conceive again, she went off of all of her medications without consulting with any of her doctors at all. This is something that I really, really recommend against no matter what medication you're on. You need to speak with someone about the risks of continuing the medication during the pregnancy versus the risks of going off of it. Sometimes it will be, we want you to continue it, or we want to tell you risks and benefits of each. Sometimes it will be, we want you to switch to a different medication that may still help whatever it is that you're going through, but would be safer for the pregnancy. So please don't go off of your medications, no matter what they are or what they're for, because you're trying to get pregnant or just had a positive pregnancy test. First, have a discussion with your healthcare provider, unless they've told you otherwise at the time that they prescribed that medication. On November 30th, 2000, Andrea gave birth to their 5th child, a baby girl named Mary. During this time, her father's health was also on the decline. Despite this, in the immediate aftermath of having the baby, she seemed to do okay keeping her mental health at a positive place. By all reports, she was throwing birthday parties and taking the kids to do fun things outside the house occasionally. She seemed to be doing overall better than she had after the birth of the 4th baby. But in March of 2001, her dad passed away, and this was an acute stressor in her life that likely contributed to the upcoming downward spiral that we will see as well.
Andrea, as much as she loved my father and was close to him, I know that this was just really, really hard on her, as it was on me too.
Even well-controlled mental illness can be acutely worsened by stressful life events, but this is particularly true for very unstable mental health disorders like an unmedicated postpartum depression, or someone with a history of postpartum psychosis or psychotic depression, as the psychiatrist earlier had called it. So this is something that is not only alarming, but should be a sign that you watch for of, okay, I have this person in my life who has a very significant mental health disorder, or even a mild mental health disorder, and now they've gone through a traumatic event, even if it's just a traumatic event that could be anticipated, right? Her father dying was going to happen at some point. He'd been sick for a long time. That doesn't make it not traumatic. This is something that I think is really important if you're caring for someone, or you just care about someone who has a mental health disorder. Check in with them, see how they're doing. Make sure you're a safe space where they can talk to you about how they're really doing with things. Less than a month after her father died, she was admitted yet again to a psychiatric unit because she had become so depressed in the aftermath of her father's death that she had stopped eating, she had stopped sleeping, she was losing a significant amount of weight to the point that she could no longer breastfeed Mary, and she was just not doing well at all. She didn't at the time report psychotic symptoms, but in hindsight, I think we will see that those were present as well. Doctors and nurses in the hospital would document that Andrea was incredibly obsessed with the safety and well-being of Mary, that she was very worried about her, and that she also was refusing IV fluids to the point of going into organ failure because she was so dehydrated. She was incredibly suspicious of the medical staff and was worried that they were trying to harm her or trying to harm her children through her. For the rest of April and May, she remained at this psychiatric facility, and during the trial that would eventually ensue, the quality and consistency of care at this private psychiatric hospital would come into question several times. Most of the reports that were reviewed in the trial would say that she was really not improving. Even other residents of the hospital would say that they could tell she wasn't getting any better. She would nod her head yes if they asked if she was thinking about hurting herself or anyone else. And she didn't seem to be responding to the medications like she had at the hospitalization that she had had previously. She wasn't started on the same medications that had worked for her in the past, and this is something that would come up in the trial as well. She was eventually discharged from this facility, still with most accounts saying that she was not improving. And the reason behind her being discharged was documented at least some parts of the medical record as being because her insurance would not cover her staying for any longer. At home, she was really not coping well. There's an account of, at some point in this timeline, her mother being on the phone with their oldest son, who was 7 at the time, and him saying that Andrea was filling the bathtub with water in the middle of the day. And the grandmother asked, well, why is she doing that? And Andrea responded, because she could hear the conversation going on, in case she needed it. I don't know how you would interpret that at the time if you were just the grandmother on the other end, but obviously now in hindsight, that's an absolutely horrifying thing to think about, because she was clearly thinking about what she ended up doing for a significant period of time prior to actually going through with it. Other things that she reported in the aftermath that had been happening when she was discharged home from the hospital was that she would hear a cartoon character giving a message to the children. She reported that she had watched "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" and a satanic character came up on screen and spoke directly to her, saying that she was marked by Satan and had eluded him long enough. She would report that there were growling noises coming from the walls of their home. She clearly was not doing well during this time.
They've been eating some candy one morning, and we had the TV on, cartoon, and it just flashed a scene where the cartoon characters were talking to us.
The cartoon characters
saying, "Hey kids, stop eating so much candy."
Okay, no.
That flash, and then back to the program.
All right. So you concluded that the TV had this special message for you and your family.
When she was discharged, presumably for insurance reasons, she had been discharged under the discussion with her family that she would never be left alone, either by herself or with the children. And so the safety plan that was in place, despite the fact that it's very obvious now the plan should have been she wasn't discharged from the hospital, and this is a major failure of the system and insurance in the current healthcare state that we operate under in the United States, but the plan was put into place that she would never be alone by herself or with the children. So Rusty and Andrea's mother were taking turns being at the house with her and with the kids. On June 20th, 2001, Rusty was going to work that morning, and Andrea's mother had not yet arrived. The plan was that they would never leave her alone, but for some reason that morning, he decided that it's a short enough time, I have to go to work, she'll be fine for this very short time frame, and your mom's on the way, she'll be here really soon. That morning, after Rusty had left for work and before Andrea's mother had arrived, Andrea would fill the bathtub in their home with water and proceed to systematically drown all 5 of her children. She would then call Rusty and tell him he needed to come home immediately, and she would phone the police tell them what had happened, and wait patiently for everyone to arrive. She was arrested immediately and never made any attempt to hide what had happened or how it had happened. I'll play some clips from Andrea's police interviews and let you just get a little bit of insight for yourself.
What were you trying to accomplish then when you did take your children's lives?
Maybe in their innocent years, God would take them up.
God would take them up to be in heaven, is that what you mean? All right. And if you had not taken their lives, what did you think would happen to them?
I guess they would have continued stumbling.
And where would they end up?
Hell.
In hell. What sort of things did they do which showed you they weren't right?
Well, they weren't. They just did a lot of silly stuff and didn't obey.
Didn't obey you when you told them to do things. All right. You mentioned their manners before. Can you give me an example of their manners?
When Rusty's mom would visit, they would just not treat her well, call her names.
Be disrespectful? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you concluded that they were not righteous, and you're a religious person, and explain to me what you meant by not being righteous.
Well, they didn't do things God likes.
You can tell from these clips that she is clearly a person who truly thought the devil had a grip on her children and that it was her fault that that had happened. She believed that the children were going to be banished to hell, and the only way that she could avoid that was to kill them. The ensuing media frenzy is difficult to describe. I remember this happening because I was living in Texas at the time, and I didn't know the events like we've discussed them here today because that's not at all what was presented in the media. Probably a lot of it was not known at that time, but it was just a lot of people debating whether she was a cold-blooded murderer or she was legally insane, or if it even mattered because, oh my gosh, look at this awful thing that she had done. And it is awful, but it's also, I don't think, the full picture of what happened here and all of the failures of people and systems and safety nets that had happened to let this awful, terrible, tragic event unfold. Obviously, mental illness does not excuse horrendous, terrible crimes. I just really want to put into this video how incredibly ill this person was. The psychiatrist at Andrea's trial would describe her as one of the sickest people that they had ever seen.
Andrea Yates sat and even sometimes watched as Dr. Gerald Harris, a psychologist called by her attorneys, testified that Yates told him Satan talked to her and she could see Satan in the jail walls. He said, quote, periodically she would look off as if she were listening to somebody else I could not see, end quote. Dr. Harris diagnosed Yates as overtly psychotic.
The case really gives us a lot to think about with regards to mental health care in general, but also the structure of healthcare in the United States and the disservice that we do to people by having it set up like it is. Andrea would actually fall into a quite privileged category in regards to that because she was able to get psychiatric care several times, inpatient psychiatric care several times. And it's really hard to get inpatient psychiatric care, particularly for people who are pregnant or postpartum and still want to have contact with their baby. And that becomes a really difficult thing when you are the person taking care of them and they don't want to be admitted because that facility won't allow them to have any contact with their baby, even supervised. And it's a big issue. And I've personally had patients in my practice back in Texas who I had trouble getting the care they needed for reasons like that. It's just not very easy in general, but it's especially difficult for people who are pregnant or recently delivered a baby. In the first year after having a baby, suicide rates increase 70%, making suicide one of the leading causes of peripartum death in the United States. To add on top of that, the numbers we discussed earlier with postpartum psychosis, with a suicide rate of 10% in people diagnosed with that, and an infanticide or murder of your children rate of 4%, you can see why this is such an incredibly important topic that receives not nearly enough discussion for people to understand what it is and what they're looking for, the warning signs that may present. If you or anyone you know is ever faced with any of the acute psychotic features that we discussed in this video, whether you're postpartum or not, this is a medical emergency and you need to seek help immediately. When we add on top of that, just the fact that it's hard to get care for that in general, the fact that she was having all of these barriers with her own psyche, with her own personality, with her social support, with the insurance, with the medical system, with what eventually would be discussed a little bit of this other doctor that she ended up seeing in the second hospitalization, not thinking that she needed the Haldol that she had been started on, which was arguably the only thing at that point that had really controlled her symptoms effectively. I don't know if there's anyone who would have been able to overcome that if given the circumstances that Andrea Yates was operating under. Again, this absolutely does not excuse what she did, but I do think it's an important part of this story. And like I said at the beginning of this video, this is a story of murder, but that is not the whole story. She went on to have her trial. The defense was never claiming that Andrea didn't murder her children. Their claim was that she was in an acute psychotic episode and was legally insane at the time. Andrea wanted to plead guilty and receive the death penalty. The state will impose the death penalty on Satan, she said, referring to herself as Satan. They interestingly only tried her for 3 of the murders because they, I guess, in case she got off, wanted to have 2 backups to try her again. I don't know how I feel about that. It's very weird to me. I didn't know that you could split the charges up like that with an event that is seemingly like one event that happened, but it's what they did. During the trial, there was a ton of argument about whether she was legally insane or not. And the level of legal insanity in Texas requires basically someone to not know whether what they were doing was right or wrong. I'll put in a clip of a bit of the discussion here.
Our approach to this case all along was to simplify the case for the jury, whether or not the person knows right from wrong, and to keep the jury focused on that issue rather than the history of mental illness.
And it was much more difficult for us to try to convince a jury to look beyond the literal interpretation as to what she thinks right and what she thinks wrong is, and make your decision on that.
I think the jurors really focused on these children and what they went through and how the evidence of the killing of these children showed her state of mind that she knew right from wrong and was responsible.
It is so difficult to overcome pajamas. It is difficult to overcome photographs. It is difficult to overcome the image of this young boy face down in the bathtub.
I think it's really interesting that they're talking about how meticulously she planned this and using that as an argument that she couldn't possibly have been legally insane. I'm not sure I fully agree with that. I'm not an attorney and I'm not on this jury, so I don't, that's not really for me to decide. But in my opinion, I feel like she was meticulous in planning this because she was fully working under the assumption that it was the right thing to do because that was how she intended to save her children. None of the police interviews that happened immediately after the murders were recorded, which is very odd. I don't know how that happened, but the conundrum that placed them in is that the jury never got to see her in the state of mind that she was in when the murders happened. She was medicated after this for her psychosis and major depression. One of the psychiatrists brought up this really interesting point.
This is a moral dilemma for a psychiatrist. It might have been to Andrea's advantage legally to not medicate her, to leave her quote unquote crazy so that the jury could see what state she was in at the time she committed the drownings.
I don't know how you work through the ethics of knowing that someone needs to be medicated for their own health, but also medicating them makes it more likely that this jury will end up saying that she's not legally insane, and that affects her outcome and sentencing. It's a very interesting thing that I've never really thought about, and I just wanted to include here because it was fascinating to me. In March of 2002, a jury unanimously rejected the insanity defense.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Andrea P. Yates, guilty of capital murder as charged in the indictment.
She subsequently went on to have sentencing, and it seems, from what I can tell, that every single person in her life was adamantly opposed to her receiving the death penalty for this. And the judge concurred and sentenced her to life in prison.
You know, the person that drowned those children is not Andrea. If your brain's sick, then you can think things that aren't real.
So because of that happened?
I don't blame her a bit. And that's, people find that just outrageous, I know, but I don't. I don't blame her one bit.
However, in early 2005, a Texas Court of Appeals actually reversed this conviction because a California psychiatrist admitted to lying on the stand, essentially. I don't know how big of a part of the trial it was, but apparently they had said that there was an episode of Law and Order where basically the same thing happened, and then someone from Law and Order who's a writer came out and said, like, that never existed. That was never an episode of the show. And because of that, and because of the appeal that was put forth by Andrea Yates' team, which said this could have influenced the jury to the decision that they came to, the conviction was overturned. In the interim, from her conviction being overturned and a new trial getting underway, she was released on bail, but under the condition that she be admitted to an inpatient psychiatric unit. In early 2006, her and her defense team entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, and a second trial went forward. This trial ended on July 26, 2006, and after 3 days of deliberation, a jury came back with a verdict.
The jury find the defendant, Andrea P. Yates, not guilty by reason of insanity.
She then was sent to an inpatient psychiatric facility, and that is where she remains to this day, at a medium security psychiatric facility in Kerrville, Texas. A few years ago, she was offered up the option of basically seeing if she could get out of the inpatient psychiatric facility that she resides in, and she turned down the opportunity to be discharged or be evaluated for discharge, and she remains there at this time. It is really interesting and terrible to think about the unique kind of hell that Andrea Yates must live in, where you were in this state of acute psychosis. You really truly believed you were killing your children to save them from hell. And then you get into the prison system or the psychiatric hospital, depending on the timing, and you get medicated with the medications that actually help you, and you're at a much more stable place, only to then have a clear mind and have to rectify what you have done to the children you, by all accounts, were incredibly invested in and doting on and just a wonderful mother to when you weren't having such struggles. I don't know how you would ever move forward coming in and out of that state of delusion and psychosis, thinking what you did was because you were saving them, to back to reality, realizing that your children were all dead at your hand. It's honestly horrific. And I think being in reality for the rest of her life is a punishment that no actual sentence probably could ever achieve. I can't even think about it.
Knowing Andrea, I can't see how a minute will go by on any day that she won't constantly think about what had happened and missing the children, that I think that she'll always be living with her pain.
Rusty ended up stating to the media that he never knew that his wife was psychotic, and that if he had been told that and that there was a high likelihood of it happening again, that he never would have said they should have more children. The merits of that are debatable because that's not the story that's told in the medical record, but I don't know that we are the ones who can actually know the truth behind that.
She was a sick woman. She was insane. She was psychotic. She believed she was saving our children. Here's a woman with a perfect record. I mean, she had never been in any trouble in her life, you know. Everyone who knows her, everyone who knew her supports her, you know. Everyone knows what a great mother she was and how out of character this act was for her.
Yates, on the other hand, told her prison psychiatrist that before they got pregnant with the last baby, she had specifically told Rusty that she didn't want to have sex because she was worried that she would get pregnant, and that Dr. Starbranch, one of the psychiatrists that she had seen, said that she might harm her children. She would go on to tell that psychiatrist that Rusty's response was to say they needed to follow their religious duty. He complimented her on how great of a mother she was and told her that she could handle having another child. Whether he was completely and utterly unaware of the severity of what she had been going through, or he has chosen to minimize that in hindsight, I don't know that we will ever know. He, by all accounts, was sympathetic towards her, never angry towards her, continued to maintain a relationship with her. He divorced her after she had been in jail for 4 years.
Coming to a decision to divorce Andrea was a really difficult decision. And it took me probably more time than it should have, but I finally came to the understanding that there's a difference between forgiveness and consequences.
And went on to get married and have another child before getting divorced again. But even through that, it seems that he maintained a strong relationship with her, speaking with her several times a month, visiting her occasionally at the jail and then at the inpatient psychiatric facility. Rusty, during the trial, successfully maintained this position that Andrea would be found innocent, and that when she was found innocent and successfully treated for her condition and released, that they would get back together physically and have more children. He kind of worked his way through how they would kind of patch up and repair this absolutely traumatically and horrifically broken life that they now had by saying that they would get pregnant or have a surrogate or adopt children. So I think worth noting that there is some level of not being a participant in reality on both sides here. One definitely from a medical standpoint, and the other, you know, I don't know where he's at or how he ended up there, but that is absolutely delusional to think that your wife will murder your 5 children, be found innocent by reason of insanity, be treated for the postpartum psychosis that likely, along with many other things, led to this happening, and then be allowed by the state to adopt children is just such a bizarre mindset to be in. I can't even get there. It's very odd. There was lots of talk during the trial and the aftermath about the quality of medical care that she had gotten, whether a significant portion of it was actually up to standard, and pretty solid arguments that it wasn't, particularly the most recent to these events, hospitalization, and the people that she was cared for during that hospitalization. While in prison, Yates told the jail psychiatrist that she had considered killing children for 2 years prior to actually doing it, and that it was because it was the 7th deadly sin that she had allowed them to stumble, to be corrupted by the world, and that they were going to go to hell if she didn't do it, and she was also going to end up in hell because she had allowed it to happen. The media was incredibly heavy-handed on scrutinizing Warnicki and their religion, I would say with good reason, in my opinion. But Warnicki and Rusty, interestingly, would vehemently deny accusations that their religious teachings had had any play in the events that unfolded. I will close this video with a quote from The Atlantic in 2012 that put into words the unique hell of being Andrea Yates in much more poetic terms than I ever could. For many years, Andrea Yates lived in a state of drug-induced purgatory. Every time she would regain some semblance of sanity, the full impact of what she had done to her beloved kids would come back at her in a wave and pull her back down into madness. The greatest novelist could not conjure up such horror.